In my opinion, it essentially saved my life since I had no idea where or what I was going to go. Yes, yes. Well, that is wonderful to hear. Wikipedia said that you declared you would never speak to Phil and Salmo again and that you are not interested. I'm not. We don't need to say anything more about that. The name Vinnie Paul will always be associated with the booming drums and the spirit of a crazy, relentless metal era. More than just Pantera's drummer. Even as the world fell apart around him, he stood as a testament to tenacity, defiance, and an unyielding devotion to music. Vinnie's distinctive double bass technique, forceful drumming style, and live, loud, die-proud attitude made him more than just a band member. Millions of admirers worldwide depended on him to keep them alive. He deserved to be considered one of the best drummers in heavy metal history, standing side by side with icons such as Dave Lombardo and Lars Ulrich. Not all of Pantera's albums, including Far Beyond Driven, Vulgar Display of Power, and Cowboys from Hell, were career turning points. They demonstrated Vinnie's unadulterated talent and his live, true, play-hard mentality. But could the emptiness he carried following the terrible death of his brother, Dimebag Darrell, be drowned out by the fame, jeers, and stage roar? At the age of 54, a man who was always the life of the party passed away peacefully and alone from heart disease. Why would a man act that way? And when the last drum beat drifted away, what was really lost? Let's explore the early life of Vinnie Paul, the man who provided the beat for a whole generation. At his core, Vinnie Paul was a Texas lad brought up on discipline and music, an unusual combination of Southern heritage and rebellious instinct, even if he towered on stage like a metal monster driven by pure wrath. He was born into a musically inclined family in Abilene, Texas, on March 11, 1964. Vinnie and his younger brother, Darrell Lance Abbott, now known as Dimebag Darrell, started their first jam sessions in the first home studio built for them by their father, Jerry Abbott, who was a country music artist, sound engineer, and eventually a producer. Vinnie was initially pushed to play brass instruments in that small house that was filled with the sound of strings and rhythms, but he soon fell in love with the drums and the primitive rhythm they produced. Vinnie was a hyperactive child from an early age who detested following the rules and enjoyed loud noises and quick tempos. In contrast to Darrell, who was fixated on guitar technique, Vinnie was drawn to iconic rock drummers like Tommy Aldridge, Kiss, Alex Van Halen, and Peter Criss, who encouraged him to hone his hard-hitting, exuberant playing style. Surprisingly, Vinnie had a unique innate sense of timing and rhythm despite being completely self-taught and depending only on gut and feel. Vinnie and Darrell had an unshakable relationship early on. They were more than simply siblings. They were soulmates in music, naturally understanding one another's riffs and beats. They started playing in local taverns as youngsters, among the roars of drunken metal fans, in dimly lit venues, and over long musical evenings. At the age of 17, Vinnie and Darrell formally established Pantera in 1981, originally adopting the glam metal aesthetic that was in vogue at the time. But Vinnie sensed something wasn't quite right beneath the sparkling clothes and makeup. He longed for a more aggressive, raw, and heavy sound. He and his brothers silently readied themselves for a metamorphosis, a genuine uprising that would ultimately rewrite heavy metal's history. Vinnie Paul's early years were characterized by a professional musical atmosphere rather than trauma or familial adversity. He was fashioned into a warrior, prepared to face the battlefield of the turbulent and eternal years that were ahead, by his unbreakable blood tie with his talented younger brother and his intense passion for drumming. Pantera's journey Pantera wasn't born into the limelight. It was fashioned with blood, sweat, and innumerable unseen nights of tenacity. When the band was founded in 1981, Vinnie Paul and his younger brother Dimebag Darrell were simply two visionary Texas teenagers pursuing the glam metal dream while performing Van Halen covers in local pubs. They wore huge hair and glossy leather pants. Like hundreds of other bands, Pantera released 4 independent albums during those early years, following the glam metal trend, but their influence was limited to the American South. Vinnie was already a very disciplined drummer at the time, accountable for the band's interior structure in addition to the rhythm. Vinnie was the operational brain, serious, calm, and unflinching, whereas Dimebag was the creative spirit. Despite their full differences, they were inseparable, like opposing poles of the same stream. One thing that remained constant was their brothers' closeness, even if the music they performed hadn't yet taken off. When Pantera brought on Philip Anselmo as frontman in 1987, replacing lead singer Terrence Lee, everything started to shift. A new, raw, untamed, and strong energy was introduced by Phil. Vinny knew right away. Glam metal was out of the question. Pantera lost all of their glitzy 80s skin after that and changed into a harder, gritty, and more angular version of themselves. Pantera themselves invented a sound that would later be referred to as groove metal. The first bullet was Cowboys from Hell, 1990. In order to produce a sound that no one could ever misunderstand, Vinny locked in with razor-sharp riffs on dime bags and played drums as if every fill were a punch to the face. But it was only the beginning. Pantera turned into a beast in 1992 with vulgar display of power. Vinny was now using his drums to command attention rather than merely play them. Vinny laid the foundations for everything. Walk, This Love, and The Mouth for War, like solid concrete. He was impressive without speed. He used space, weight, and nearly military-level accuracy to smash listeners. Pantera became metal's sharpest answer, and Vinny kept its heart beating during a period when grunge was on the rise and thrash metal was on the decline. By 1994, Pantera had gone far beyond simply rebelling. They were gaining power. For a pure metal band with no radio singles and no compromises, the album's arrival at #1 on the Billboard 200 seemed nearly unimaginable. Behind the scenes, Vinny kept everything running smoothly, from tour plans to sound and production management to occasionally even overseeing Phil, who was descending into self-destruction and addiction. However, they shattered more as Pantera ascended higher. Phil Anselmo grew more erratic and aloof, even skipping recording sessions. Ever the meticulous perfectionist, Vinny was unable to put up with the lack of discipline. He saw it as the betrayal of his family, not just the disappearance of a bandmate. Phil didn't hold it together, but Vinny did. Heavy atmospheres, exhausting months-long tours, and rising animosity among members replaced the excitement of playing. Dimebag found himself in the middle of the conflict between his brother and the singer he used to be close to. Pantera's last two albums would be Reinventing the Steel, 2000, and The Great Southern Trendkill, 1996. The band was no longer a cohesive unit, but the music was still fierce. Phil left to work on other projects. Pantera broke up in 2003. Anger and acrid silence, without a handshake or an apology. It was the collapse of Vinnie Paul's entire world, not just the loss of a band. Pantera represented everything he and his brother had created together since they were little children jamming in their father's garage. It was more than simply a job. His profession was not the only thing that was ruined by the split. He lost a piece of himself in it. However, Vinny was unaware that the worst suffering was still to come, a terrible night that would leave a permanent scar on his heart. And Vinny would never be the same man again after that. Rebirth and tragedy. Vinnie Paul virtually vanished from the stage when Pantera broke up in quiet and resentment. He withdrew into his own universe, where recollections of a once bright metal empire had now turned to ashes, refused to talk about the band, and shunned the media. However, his passion for music persisted. Vinny and his brother Dimebag Darrell made the decision to start again in 2003, starting a new chapter called Damage Plan instead of Pantera. In an attempt to produce something fresh, they recorded the album Newfound Power, something they had complete control over, but not Pantera 2.0. The brothers were able to express themselves freely with Damage Plan, free from the lingering internal strife that had previously plagued them. They went on tour and came back to the stage with their former vigor, but this time there was a hint of emptiness, weariness, and caution. Vinny was aware that Damage Plan would never be able to fully replace Pantera, no matter how much they tried to smile. Additionally, it was unable to mend the wounds in their hearts. Then, one evening in December 2004, Vinnie Paul's world was irrevocably shattered. Damage Plan was playing at Columbus, Ohio's Alrosa Villa nightclub on the evening of December 8th when an armed guy barged onto the stage and shot Dimebag Darrell dead in front of Vinny. The gunman, Nathan Gale, a former Marine with delusional paranoia, came that night with the explicit intent to kill a man who was adored by millions of people because he thought Dimebag had stolen his music. He killed 4 individuals with a total of 15 shots before a policeman rushed the stage and shot him dead. Vinny was only a couple of feet away. On the stage they had called home, he witnessed his brother, his musical soulmate and collaborator of almost 2 decades, pass away. That level of suffering is beyond description. There is never a brother who is ready to see his brother killed on stage. After such a catastrophe, no musician can stay upright. Vinny was no longer Vinnie Paul of Pantera after a piece of his soul perished with Dimebag that night. Vinny vanished once more when Dime passed away. He turned down every invitation to work together, even severed ties with friends that were formerly close. He had a calm, solitary existence with only his fiancée Chelsea, his loved ones, and copious amounts of booze. To forget, not to get wasted. It was almost 3 years before Vinny touched a drum kit once more, and this time he was with total strangers rather than his brother. Vinny received an invitation to join Hell Yeah in 2006, a metal supergroup made comprised of Nothing Face and Mudvayne members. He initially vehemently objected. He once remarked, "I have nothing left to play." However, after considerable convincing, he consented to give it a try, just once. Vinny cried during that first jam session because, for the first time since that terrible night, he felt like he could breathe again, not because it sounded nice. Dimebag could not be replaced. But with Hell Yeah, he was back behind the drums, perspiring, and experiencing the kind of sensation that only a stage performer can fully comprehend, the shouts and bass echoing through his chest. Pantera wasn't Hell Yeah. It was not necessary. It was a site of rebirth for Vinny. When their debut album came out in 2007, Vinny made a formal comeback to the metal scene, not as an icon, but as a survivor. He released more albums, went on tour with Hell Yeah, and made an effort to lead a regular life in the years that followed, but his close friends and family could tell. Vinny never fully recovered from Dimebag's passing. He constantly carried a pendant with his brother's ashes. Dime used to stand next to his drum kit, but there was always an empty chair there, and no one could ever fill the void that constantly existed inside of him. He once said, "I wouldn't be alive." And so he stayed, playing, screaming, laughing, drinking, and living, battered but unbreakable. It was the only way Vinnie Paul knew how to survive hell. Personal life. On stage, Vinnie Paul was the embodiment of raw energy, long hair draped over a beaming face, a smile that never faded, and drum hits that felt like punches thrown into the air. Off stage, he was known as the soul of every party, a man with seemingly endless energy. Vinnie loved the noise, loved the booze, loved the laughter, and loved making sure everyone around him had a good time. In the metal world, he wasn't just Pantera's drummer. He was the ultimate host, the man behind the legendary all-night parties where beer, rock and roll, and brotherhood blended into something sacred. The symbol of that lifestyle was the cocktail he and Dimebag loved most, the Black Tooth Grin, a mix of Crown Royal and Coke, strong, dark, and sweet, just like the music they played. From backstage tour hangouts to living rooms in Texas, the Black Tooth Grin served as a toast to unbreakable brotherhood and a way for Vinny to keep his brother's memory alive in every raised glass. But after Dimebag's death, the drink became a double-edged sword, fueling his laughter while concealing the silence no one was allowed to see. Despite being present at nearly every major party, Vinny was intensely private about his personal life. He never married and had no children, not because he didn't want to, but because for him, music and Dimebag were relationships deep enough to leave no room for anything else. For many years, he was in a long-term relationship with Chelsea Yeager, a model nearly 2 decades his junior. She was more than just a girlfriend. She was a quiet companion who stood by him through countless shows, sharing both the spotlight and the silent moments backstage. Vinny once said he didn't like being alone, but he didn't need a crowd either. What he truly needed was music, whiskey, and memory. 3 things that could either destroy you or save you. Those close to him recalled that even though he was the life of every party, when he returned to his room, he would often sit alone, quietly playing old Pantera tapes or setting out an empty chair next to his drum kit for Dimebag. For Vinny, there was no such thing as getting over the pain. There was only learning to live with it. He once dreamed of writing a cookbook titled Drumming Up an Appetite with Vinnie Paul, where he would share his favorite recipes mixed with backstage stories full of laughter and liquor. That book was never completed. Like so many things in Vinny's life, it remained an unfinished plan. A man who spent his life playing drums, but carried within him a void no one could ever fill. A man who could shake thousands of fans to their core, yet sat silently through long, lonely nights. That was Vinnie Paul, a man who lived for music as if there were no tomorrow, and loved his late brother as if he were still right there beside him, guitar in hand, ready to tear the world apart one more time. Final years. Though he had entered his 50s and carried a scar that would never heal from Dimebag's death, Vinnie Paul never once stepped away from the stage. For him, music wasn't just a career. It was an escape, the only way he could survive everything he had lost. With Hell Yeah, he continued releasing albums, touring, and living out the same play-hard spirit he had in the Pantera days. as if the years of tragedy had never happened. And yet, even as the lights still blazed and the drums still thundered, people began to notice something. Vinny had changed. He still smiled, still partied, still roared every time he took the stage, but his eyes, once lit with boundless life, now held a quiet melancholy. Behind the familiar swagger was a man who had grown increasingly withdrawn, a survivor more than a warrior. Even in the middle of the crowd, Vinny kept a subtle distance, a hollow space that only Dimebag had ever been able to fill. He rarely spoke of the past. Whenever asked about Pantera or Dimebag, Vinny would deflect, offering short replies or a faint, strained smile. But no one blamed him. Everyone understood. Some pains can only be endured in silence because to speak of them would be to shatter. At an age when many musicians chose to rest, Vinny kept living as if racing against time. One concert after another, endless studio sessions, parties without pause. It was as if his life beat to a drum rhythm that wouldn't allow him to stop. But his body could no longer keep pace with the heart of an immortal rocker. Age and unbalanced lifestyle, and years of emotional and physical work finally began to take their toll. On June 22, 2018, Vinnie Paul was found dead in his sleep at his Las Vegas home. The cause was determined to be dilated cardiomyopathy, a heart condition that weakens the heart's ability to pump blood, combined with severe coronary artery disease. He passed away at the age of 54 without any final words, no stage lights, no drum solo, just a quiet night. It was a departure that contrasted starkly with the way he lived, but perhaps it was the only way he could finally rest after decades of living each day like it might be his last. Vinny was laid to rest beside Dimebag Darrell at Moore Memorial Gardens Cemetery in Arlington, Texas. Two caskets, side by side, etched with the names of the two brothers. Warriors who had together written the most glorious chapter of groove metal, now reunited in the same earth, as if they had never been apart. There was no grand ceremony, no public funeral, but the global metal community fell silent in mourning. Artists from Metallica, Anthrax, Slipknot, Lamb of God, and more shared tributes. Thousands of fans brought candles, Pantera shirts, drumsticks, and black-toothed grin tattoos to the cemetery to say their goodbyes. In a rock and roll world where legends often come and go amid scandal and noise, Vinnie Paul chose a different path, quiet, steadfast, and fiercely loyal, to music, to his late brother, and to the values he never betrayed. His final years were not a closing chapter, but a last affirmation that no matter what fell apart, would keep drumming until his heart could no longer follow the beat. Legacy and impact. Vinnie Paul was not the fastest drummer, nor the most complex, and he never sought to show off his technique just to prove a point. But with every strike, whether the machine gun blast of becoming or the slow crushing pound of walk, he created his own language, a language of weight, precision, and the rawest instincts of heavy metal. Together with Dimebag Darrell, Vinnie didn't just give Pantera its soul, he helped give birth to an entirely new genre, groove metal. At a time when thrash was fading, grunge dominated the airwaves, and many metal bands were compromising just to survive, Pantera, driven by Vinnie's hammering drums, stood tall, refused to bend, and pulled metal back to its primal brutality. Vinnie's influence wasn't just in the music he played, but in the way he lived and kept the fire burning for the metal community. He was the kind of artist who never acted like a star, always ready to hug a fan, raise a drink with anyone after a show, and share backstage stories like an old friend. That authenticity made him a legend who didn't need to be idolized, just remembered. Many drummers of the next generation openly acknowledged his impact. Chris Adler, Lamb of God, Joey Jordison, Slipknot, Jason Bittner, Shadows Fall, all named Vinnie as a role model, not just for his playing, but for his mastery of space, his ability to maintain groove in a genre that can easily descend into chaos. Vinnie wasn't just a drummer. He was the emotional conductor of the entire song, the lifeline that kept the band from falling apart. His legacy was also clear in how he stayed true to himself and his philosophy until the very end. He never chased trends, never forced himself to change to please the market, never cashed in on a Pantera reunion. Vinnie understood the real value of being an artist, and he never sold it short. That's why even though Helion never reached the heights of Pantera, the community respected him deeply because he never stopped fighting. Today, the name Vinnie Paul isn't just listed among the greatest metal drummers, it's etched into a golden era. A time when heavy metal didn't need gimmicks, stages didn't need laser lights, and artists didn't need scandals to be seen. He was the primal beat, the foundation, the pulse beneath the skin of every true metal believer. At the cemetery in Arlington, Texas, beside Dimebag Darrell's grave, there is a headstone engraved with the words, "Don't ever think it's not worth it. Fight until you can't." That line isn't just a life philosophy. It's the entire life of Vinnie Paul, the man who kept time for an entire generation, not with words, but with drum beats born from a heart full of blood, full of fire, and that never once knew surrender. Vinnie Paul didn't fade away like a dying star. He went out like one final drum beat echoing through the darkness, loud enough to awaken, deep enough to haunt, and real enough to never be forgotten. He didn't need radio hits, million-dollar studios, or spotlights shining on his name. All he ever needed was his drum kit, a brother with a guitar by his side, and a crowd of screaming fans, and that was enough for a life worth living. From piecing together riffs in his father's garage to topping the Billboard charts with Pantera and finally shattering into blood and tears in Columbus, Vinnie Paul walked a path no one else could ever replicate. He was the embodiment of loyalty to music, to Dimebag, and to his own true self, even if it cost him his youth, his family, and ultimately his life. What do you think of the life of Vinnie Paul, a journey filled with pain, fire, and unbreakable spirit? To you, what is the greatest legacy he left behind? Was it the relentless drum beats, the brotherhood that defied death, or the live, loud spirit that never once broke? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to keep joining us on the journey through the immortal legends of rock and metal.